Welcome to this week's seminar. As you know, every once a month we have two speakers present. This week we have the pleasure of having Jordan Chan and Maryam Oct. And Jordan will be talking about the Living La Vida Loca through Chilean entrepreneurs and fishers in Chile. And we're going to have about a 20 minutes presentation and then 10 minutes discussion. And then we'll go on to the next talk. So it's a little shorter, more condensed than other speaker talks. So we're prepared to have questions.
Okay. All right, hi everyone. I think everyone here knows me. It looks like it's mostly yesers. So I'll be talking a little bit about some of the research I did in Chile. About a year ago, I went down, and the title of my talk is Living La Vida Loco with Chilean Artisanal Fishers, and I'll explain what loco means. And I don't have pages here, but that's her title, which I stole. And just a little bit about me, if you don't know, my background or my bachelor's was in psychology, so I'm very interested in human behavior and what drives human behavior and changes in human behavior. And I'm trying to apply that kind of thinking to resource management issues. So I'll get started here. All right, since it's a lunchtime talk, I thought I would start with this bowl of seafood stew, which is called paella marina, which is one of my favorite dishes in Chile. But another reason I'm starting with this is because actually a lot of the ingredients in this stew come from a unique kind of management system, or they're extracted through a unique management system in Chile for benthic resources. So a lot of shellfish in that case. And so I want to give you some context for that management system and why I'm studying it and why it's interesting. All right. Well, this particular snail up here, concholepas, or loco, as it's colloquially called in Chile, isn't in that stew, is actually one of the major export species in Chile, so it's a very important resource. And it has a very interesting story, which I'd like to tell you, because it's the kind of the backdrop for why management changed the way it did over the past few decades and why it looks the way it does today. So in 1974, there was a political coup, which led to a widespread opening of the markets, which you can see here, and led to a large amount of extraction, basically uncontrolled, into the 90s, where there was a collapse here. At the same time, democratic elections were held in the 90s, and then this created what some would call a window of opportunity for major and large-scale policy changes throughout the country to manage this stock. And so partly as a consequence of this species collapsing, new fisheries and aquaculture law was implemented, and as part of that, the management and exploitation area for benthic resources was also implemented, and I'll tell you a little bit about what that is now. So as part of the changes in the law, one of the major things that occurred was an exclusive 5-mile nautical zone was made exclusive to small-scale artisanal fishers. And at the same time, the MEABR, or the Management and Exploitation Areas for Benthic Resources Policy, basically gave the right to fisheries co-ops, or unions rather, to exploit exclusive areas of seabed for benthic fisheries, and that includes the loco. So what that means is, as a group, fishermen or fisherwomen can apply for a license to extract benthic resources from a designated area on the seabed, and that access is exclusive to them, and so no one else can incur there. Which the idea was behind that was to basically change it from a tragedy of the commons, where formerly these resources were exploited in an open access kind of manner, to community-held resources, providing incentive for them to invest and monitor them and also protect them, hopefully preventing further exploitation. And when I'm talking about small-scale artisanal fishers, there's basically two kinds. The kind that I was mostly focused on, which is the very small scale, which is boats that are less than 10 meters in length. And then there's also the mid-scale artisanal fleet, which go up to about 18 meters. And then there's the industrial fleet that operates outside that, at that zone, which is this grayed out area here. The unique thing about this then is, and this is the reason why I went down there, is because this kind of set up a quasi-natural experiment where you have all of these unions who have access to exclusive areas of seabed for extraction, and in ecological areas where you can do some kind of comparison where it's relatively constant in terms of its comparability. And I want to see how much the social conditions and political situation, which is also held constant at a national level, what factors were driving behavioral changes in these places. Today in the 2000s, these unions are basically range from 20s to hundreds of people each, and these spaces are occupied by many different stakeholders, including the small-scale artisanal fishers, as well as industry, as you can see in the picture above. And they're also multi-species fisheries, so they're not exclusively fishing for one type of species or extracting one type of benthic resource, but as you can see, they're going for crab, finfish, and kelp in some instances. At the same time, there's rapid economic growth happening in the country, and as has been for the past decade. And in the area where I was, tourism is also a major industry and growing industry. So in academia, we're trying to understand kind of these types of settings where in Chile as linked social and ecological systems. And I drew from 4 different types of literatures, ecosystem-based management, but mostly I focused on resilience theory, common pool resource theory, and vulnerability theory. Well, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail right now about that just because of time. I just want to say that I see them, those 3, resilience, CPR, and vulnerability, as being kind of brought together under, or can be related to under the concept of adaptive capacity, as each literature is concerned about how people change over time and systems change over time as linked to ecosystems. So that is kind of the focus of my research, is trying to understand what is adaptive capacity, can we measure it, what does it look like, how does it change over time, and what are the processes involved in lesser or more adaptive capacity. So here are my 2 research questions, which did change while I was there. The first is what ecological environmental changes and their drivers are recognized by fishers, the rationale behind this being it's hard to understand why people are changing and how a system is changing if you don't first understand what are the things that people are reacting to. And the second question is, how do fishers actually respond, so in their actual behaviors and perceptions, to social and environmental changes that they've identified. Okay, so these are my study sites. Chile, as you know, as you can probably saw in the last slide, has an extremely long coastline. And I focused my research in only one region, the 5th region, which is about 200 kilometers of coast here. And I visited 9 different so-called caletas, which is basically translate to coves. And that's where these unions are based out of, and they operate out of these areas. And these areas also where they disembark or that's where they have their landings, where the fish come in and then go to market. As you can see, my sites are very close to Santiago, which is the major metropolitan city in Chile and the capital. So where I was, there's a lot of infrastructure, there's quite a lot of people living there, so high density of people, and most of these sites are backing onto or integrated within towns or cities. Only a couple of them are more rural. All right, so what did I do there? I basically went to, as I said, 9 different caletas or communities and conducted 2 surveys with about 100 participants in each one, using both qualitative and quantitative questions. The first survey, well, both surveys are quite long actually, but the first survey focused primarily on perceived ecological and environmental changes and their causes from their perspective. And the second survey focused on adaptation behaviors regarding types of gear used and switched or added to or added. Behaviors related to income sources, whether or not they diversified their income streams or changed their income sources, and the types of species or primary species that they would fish for. And this would include benthic or finfish. And I went out there for a period of about 2 months. I was in the field with some assistants, and we basically went to each of these communities in the landing areas, and as the fishermen came in or came to work, we would ask them to see whether or not they would be willing to participate after we spoke to the union presidents. So I'll show you now just a few of my results, and then I'll just, talk you through them. So one of the major things I found was that, when I'm reading the literature, when I was reading the literature, often you hear this phrase or something similar to it like, everything's context dependent, or context really matters, and I didn't really understand what that meant until I went there. And it's quite striking to find that everything changes depending on context. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. But so out of my first survey, when I asked people, what are the major environmental or ecological changes occurring in your specific Caleta area, in your fishing zone, and what do you think are the causes? This is two results from 2 different communities, Ventanas on the left and Quintai on the right. Now Ventanas is that picture I showed you earlier with the fishermen pulling the boats out of the water and the power plant in the background. That's Ventanas. And it's a place that suffered a lot of damage from pollution because of those plants. And so tourism is not a big driver there because nobody wants to sit on the beach there. And the fish stocks in terms of shellfish has been decimated and likely contaminated, so what they suspect. Quintai, on the other hand, is a very small rural community, not backing onto a township or city. And so what's being shown here is from the qualitative answers they gave me about the major environmental changes. On the left are the perceived causes of changes, the means, so means causes, and then on the right side for each Caleta, the endpoint, so what is the thing that's being changed. And here, these are simplified diagrams because otherwise you'd have arrows all over the place, but for every thick arrow, or the only arrow shown here, are those factors influencing another factor that was mentioned more than twice or more, basically. So the neat thing to notice here is that in Ventanas, the black boxes are social, quote unquote, social factors. That seems to be the major thing that people notice and that draws their attention. And that makes sense because in that area, the major issue is pollution, contamination from factories. Whereas on the right, you can see here, most of the changes that people are observing are, quote unquote, abiotic or environmental. So here, climate change affecting currents and surges, currents affecting water temperatures, and the abundance of one species or another affecting the abundance of another species. So ecological linkages there. Whereas that is largely, and if it's not on here, if a box isn't on here, it just means that it was never mentioned at all, right? So you can see here there's quite a big difference in the types of observations being made by fishermen in each place. And I think it's close here. They're not that far apart, right? Quintai is here, and Ventanas is here. So there's real heterogeneity in types of perceived changes occurring in a specific area, even if they're not spatially that distant. This also extends, the heterogeneity also extends to individual types of behaviors, and for many different types of reasons. One of the interesting phenomena that occurred when I was there was this ongoing spread of this new net technology called Tres Mayas, which basically means 3 individual nets which are combined in one. And it's become very popular because it's very efficient. It's easy to deploy, and it catches a lot of fish. And I saw this in every spot I went to, many more people using this kind of net, and it's only occurred in the past probably 2 or 3 years, maybe 2 to 5 years, I would guess. But a lot of people, for instance, in Quintai, chose not to use the net despite it being more effective and more efficient because they simply didn't have a market to sell to. In Quintai, because they don't have a very easily accessible market, The fishermen chose not to use that because they couldn't sell off the extras. Whereas in other places, if there were more tourists or more businesses, so restaurants, this was being deployed quite often. Another interesting one was in the north of the country where it's much drier, it's quite a big industry to start to harvest kelp, which is used in food processing and also for different types of like cosmetics and things like this after they've been processed to create alginic acid. But I've talked to a lot of people were interested in harvesting it if the price would go up. But some people were also completely opposed to harvesting this kelp, even though it was a resource that was available, due to ecological reasons, because they understood that these are habitat for juvenile fish. And so on principle alone, they said, no, they wouldn't be willing to harvest that. And finally, at a community level, this type of heterogeneity was also observed. When an aggregate amount of behavior scales up to the community level, there are impacts. And so in Ventanas, like I said, they're dealing with pollution from these power plants and other processing plants. Heavy metals leach into the water. And in honesty, when I was there, it was actually very difficult to find people to even talk to because most of them had given up the work of fishing and gone on many of them had gone on to work for the plants themselves and thus becoming part of, without another choice, they became part of the issue that they were initially fighting against, which is kind of sad. Whereas in Orcon, which is actually literally 2 kilometers basically down the road, you could walk there between these 2 towns. This is still a thriving fishing community, as you can see with all the boats here, with around, I believe, 70 active fishermen, whereas here I think I maybe saw 11 people fishing, and many tourists and lots of people visiting here during the summer days. This is around the same time, so it's quite a stark difference. But it's very interesting to find out where, as I said, context really matters in this case, and this is a separation of a single road, and so it's quite stark. Okay, in resilience, in the resilience literature, one of the major kind of concepts is about thresholds, and one of the major unresolved issues is, are ecological systems at all like social systems, or are social systems like ecological systems? When we're talking about thresholds, we're talking about the identity of a system changing into a different type of regime, right? I don't actually have an answer for this, but what I think is occurring in Chile might constitute a social threshold. And what's occurring here is that the lifestyle of fishing is not something that is growing in popularity. In fact, it's shrinking. And many people, when I asked the fishermen who are older, around the average age of the fishermen that I interviewed was around 53 years old. I asked them, do you want your children and family to be involved in artisanal fishing and diving? Here's 116 people answering. 1 on the left side indicates a strong disagreement, and 5 is a strong agreement. So the vast majority of people not wanting their family to be engaged in this kind of industry anymore, wanting them to exit basically because there are, as they perceive it, greater opportunities in getting your education and going out to work in the globalized economy. At the same time, you can see here, in response to the question of whether or not people are switching their income sources, 58 out of 113, I believe, indicated yes, they had switched their original or their principal source of income as well, and or added another source of income. The original here in red, many people switching away or adding new sources of income away from fishing into many diverse types of income sources, but mostly construction. These are mostly low, generalized labor types of professions. So the consequence of this is potentially within a generation, if no new fishermen are coming in, and that's what I observed in the areas I was in, very few young fishermen entering the industry, and people switching away, I think there are huge implications for the sustainability of the entire management system of artisanal fisheries that's been implemented across the country so far, which amounts to about 700 different communities that are operating these benthic resource zones. And so I don't know what the consequence of that is in the long run, but I think it'll be something to watch. And finally, I want to just point out, when asked whether or not people had switched the principal type of species that they fished for, it's clear that in these multi-species fisheries that there are, quote unquote, a lot of options, but when you look closer at the data, specifically, for example, if you look at here, squid, a lot of people have been going for squid, reef fish, and kelp, as I mentioned before. While it looks like there's a lot of options here, a lot of these are highly dependent on things like available infrastructure, the specific ecology of a place, whether or not this kind of opportunity can be taken advantage of, whether or not there's a market that's available, and also individual types of principles, whether or not they feel like kelp is something that it's worth going for, but also just the sheer amount of labor. And so what my point here is, it's not just an economic type of choice, whether or not they choose to go for a new type of fish or not. There's many things going on that need to be paid attention to. So adaptive capacity is often tossed around like it's a general kind of measurable trait, but in my experience and from my research, it appears that it needs to be very specific to a certain kind of change. The implications, I don't know yet. A lot of this I'm still processing. I'm still in the middle of my data analysis. So often I feel like this. I do. Or often I look like this, maybe. I guess I'd say I have more questions left than I do have answers. I think it's certainly clear that one of the biggest things I would have to say is that even though context clearly matters, I don't find it useful to say that because I think it's an easy kind of junk drawer that you can throw everything into. It's like, oh, well, context matters. And I think that's kind of what I want to do with this research, is try to figure out exactly what that means and what are the aspects of that are driving the system and systems change. At the same time, I think there needs to be a lot more clarity in the literature that I was drawing from about resilience and vulnerability and adaptive capacity to consider different types of scales and really digging about what specific adaptive capacity and resilience means versus a generalized kind. I think actually there's room for both to exist, but a much greater distinction between them needs to be made. And with that, I'll just thank my funders, SSHRC, the Lou Institute, and the Chilean Funding Agency, and of course the communities of fishers, which were very generous in helping me, my committee, the lab groups I was part of, and all of my assistants, which made this possible because my Spanish is terrible. So thanks very much. We're doing questions now? Okay. Was that Melinda? Yeah. Did I go there? Okay. The original intent of going down there was I had this idea of, I had a very strong idea that institutions would be very powerful in driving, the success or non-success of these different types of management, or this type of management within each community. So I was expecting that I would find that, if I could parse out the types of institutions that existed in each place, even though they were under a national type of policy, the idea was that each one would develop independently, and so come up with unique ways of dealing with the stresses in each location. So I want to go down there and examine, holding something relatively constant, if I could identify what those institutions were, why they worked or didn't work, and basically try to parse that out. What ended up happening is, as I think is common in most instances, is I went down there and discovered that the situation is not at all alike to what I thought it was. And so I had to change the question to try to understand, okay, the institutions are actually quite uniform across all the communities because there's actually very little room to maneuver under the national policy. And so my question became, okay, if that's the case, then how are people actually changing their behaviors within that kind of restricted context? which is why I was asking questions about actual behavior change related to gear, species, and income sources, and to try to get an understanding of how that system, or this entire system, is going to change, at least given what I saw, into the future. Is that? Well, actually, so the institutions, the structure of it is actually quite strong there, and it's held up as a good example of fisheries management. But what I found is when you look a little closer, depending on where you are and which community you're in, those institutions may matter or may matter not at all, depending on the other types of stressors that are impacting that community. So for instance, in Ventanas, where that institution is, it's made to protect this benthic resource, when that resource is annihilated or contaminated by industry outside, the community basically loses incentive to try to maintain it, right? It's an imposed cost that they have to deal with. And so what does that mean for the community then and for the fishermen? Well, it turns out that they move on to work for the very factories that are polluting the area, for one. And secondly, the fish stock there, or the fishermen, have basically disappeared. That resource is gone. One interesting thing there, though, is that, like I said, Orcon, which is just down the road, is affected by the same contamination, but it's still thriving. What's neat there is there's this phenomena. What I think is happening is, in Orcon, historically, they were mostly fin fishers, and in Ventanas, they're mostly benthic shellfishers or divers. And so the impact of that one stressor is very different on both communities, because depending on where you originally came from, if you see yourself as a fisherman, literally a fisherman, or a diver, it changes how you react to the problem, right? And the available options that are available to you. So that's a good question about what did I originally go down for. That's what I went down for, but it changed drastically since then. But I still think it's an interesting place to research. Yeah. I was there in November until March. Yeah. Okay. I think when I asked, so with all the communities, when I asked them about environmental and ecological changes, a lot of them mentioned, yeah, El Nino phenomenon, and phenomena that were related to that perceptively. Is your question whether or not there was a noticeable difference in between the two? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's a good question.
And also whether variability was something that was already driving people who were more subject to variability to get out because they were sick and tired of not having constant income. And so whether or not there is opportunity comes, even if it's a lower income, but it's consistent, to the switch.
Right.
So I'm wondering if
I don't know about specifically whether or not variability in that regard from El Nino and El Nino was could be the cause for that. I don't have evidence for that. But in terms of variability, in terms of income, a lot of people did tell me that they did switch to less desirable types of occupations, like construction. I mean, a lot of these people are attached to their jobs, right? They would like to be fishermen or divers if they could maintain it. And they understand that it's a highly variable kind of, you can have a good day, a bad day, or a good year, or a bad year. But a lot of them did switch because of the income stability offered by construction, or would take up work to stabilize their incomes.
I'm worried about the analysis.
Yeah.
So we're going to have a conversation.
Sure, sure.
Is that given where they live, they may have a very different background perception of variability in the field,
Right.
and not even half your life.
That's true. Yeah. No, that's true. There's a lot here that I still have to discover, and it's not, I didn't get at that piece, whether or not there was a difference between the communities in that regard. Yeah. I would imagine that there is.
Really sorry I have to interrupt. Sure, that's fine. You're not sorry. Feel free to talk. We want to hear you talk. Thank you. Jordan, let's get Jordan.
Flip the cable.
When they're switching microphones, you can have Maryam this side. Just let me know when the lights are off, that there is somebody. It sounds quite more like a novel. Is that a novel?
Nope, it is not.
Okay, she'll explain to us why the movie.
It's
Huh?
it's
Halloween.
sure. Many explanations for that title.
There's not one of our students right down here, and she'll talk about energy, electricity.
Yep. If there was a former U.S. president, I feel like often it'd be Bill Clinton in the aftermath of. I constantly feel like, how did I end up in this mess? And I honestly feel like the process by which I end up in that mess is exactly the same as how he ends up in that mess. It's following every whim, semi-unprincipled. So here we are. My title is also not my doing, but I'm only half committed to it, which is why I put half of it up. So I look at energy access, especially when it becomes a problem, and some days we call it energy poverty. If I were to define it broadly and qualitatively, it'd be having a hard time meeting one's basic energy needs. And what I do is take that statement apart. That's what I'll be doing for the next year, perhaps. That's what I've been doing for the past 3 years. So I ask questions like, okay, what's having a hard time? Like, is it missing paying your bills? Is it having spending a large portion of your income on your bills? Is it not having heating at all? And then I ask things like, what are basic energy needs? Like, okay, so you need heating, but do you need air conditioning? And is it a necessity to have 9 freezers? By the way, if you answered no to that question, ask me how it might be later. So there are different indicators for this. One of them is to look at household expenditures. So what portion of their income they spend on their energy. And, oh, there we go. Oops. There. So this is one way of looking at it. This is 2009 data from the Survey of Household Spending, and it looks at the fraction of household income that gets spent on electricity and heating bills in Canada. And so one of the ways that a threshold for energy poverty is set is looking at the median across Canada and saying, okay, if you're spending more than twice the median, then you're facing disproportionate burdens. So in Canada, that median is somewhere around 3.5%. Twice that is around 7%, and that's my dotted line. Anyone who falls above that line is sort of thought to be facing disproportionately high energy burdens. And one of the things I want you to notice is how it's not purely an income problem. So if you look at the lowest income category over here, there's about 50% of them that fall below the dotted line. So one of the fun things for me to figure out is how it's related to income and how it's different. Another way of thinking about energy poverty is to ask how it's felt, how it affects comfort. So I'm going to do a terrible thing. I'm going to show you a figure and ask you to ignore half of it. So please ignore the color coding. So the green and the gray don't mean anything as far as you're concerned. I've asked people how often they feel like their house is warm enough in winter. And then I've coded it as a binary, people who said always and usually warm enough, and people who said never, rarely, or sometimes warm enough. And on the y-axis, I have the fraction of income spent on energy. And the interesting thing is this area over here, where I have people who wouldn't, by an income indicator, by an expenditure-based indicator, wouldn't be considered energy poor, but are never warm enough. So I worry about what we might do with those and how to capture those. So one other way of thinking about it, and this is something I do, is to say, okay, if you're feeling like you're facing higher energy burdens, then it probably affects how you do things. So I ask, how does that manifest itself in how people do energy-related things around the house? So I look at household practices, and this draws on practice theory, and I'll get to what I do there in a bit. There's one other aspect of that statement up above that I didn't take apart yet. It's the ones. So who are we talking about? The literature always talks about it at the household level. That's another thing that I like to complicate a little bit, and so I ask what happens if you think about it at a different scale. So I asked two kinds of research questions. One of them is, what factors, geographic, regulatory, sociodemographic, infrastructural, affect how people feel, how much energy burden people feel? And I can already give you some answers about that. If you live in a northern remote community, it's higher burdens. If you live in a deregulated province with a deregulated electricity industry, you face higher burdens. If you live in older homes, doesn't really affect you. If you have older heating equipment, doesn't really seem to significantly affect it. Older people tend to have higher burdens. But the question that really interests me is this other one of how does energy poverty manifest itself in how people experience comfort, how they do things, and how they talk about their energy use and access, both at the household and community levels. And the reason I ask this question, and the reason I'm more excited about this question, is because I want to make sure I'm capturing something with that first analysis, something that actually relates to the experience. And this is my way of prodding the experience, being like, okay, well, what is it that I'm trying to study? What does it actually look like? Now, how I answer those questions is I look at two Statistics Canada surveys, the Survey of Household Spending and the Survey of Household Energy Use, and there are numerous editions of those. And then they don't really ask comfort-related questions. They also have really terrible data quality for northern and remote and on-reserve communities, so it didn't really do some of the things I wanted it to do. So I have my own surveys, which I'm doing at two communities, Musqueam and Seke, and qualitatively I do semi-structured interviews, again, at both places. So I'll tell you a little bit about why those communities. Musqueam is obviously on the grid, and there's some 250 households. I surveyed 100 of them, and I won't tell you too much about this particular case study today, but it's a three-phase study. I did my survey, they'll get retrofits, and then so I went along and observed the energy retrofits that the households get, and this is a way of addressing energy poverty, and then I'll go back in a year and see if that helps. Seke is a different story. It's a remote community, and by that I mean it's not on the electricity grid or the natural gas network. So they use diesel generators to make electricity, and it's considerably more expensive than it is for us down here, about 6 times more, but that's electricity. And heating is done using propane, which is, again, considerably more expensive than it is for us. There is another reason I like to talk about Seke, and it's because it allows me to talk about energy poverty at the community scale. So of course, households do feel it, but it's a slightly different arrangement of energy service provision where the band is really involved in paying for electricity. So it allows me to talk about it at the community scale. And then there is one more layer that makes it complicated and interesting, and it's the fact that Seke has a particular history of energy development in and around it, which adds to the story that I want to tell. So that brings us back to that first picture. This is the Williston Lake Reservoir, which supplies the water for the W.C. Bennett Dam, and that's where about 1/3 of the electricity in BC comes from. What's interesting about Seke is that this is a community that was displaced in the process of making this dam. So their lands were flooded, and they have now ended up at the northern edge of this lake, and they're not on the grid. And this is a quote That comes from an unfinished and unpublished memoir that one of the people I interviewed wrote about that displacement. It's terse like Hemingway, but more sentimental, and it's really awesome. But sadly, I will not get to talk about that. So what I do want to talk about is how that features in the experience of energy poverty. And so a lot of people that I talk to, especially the elders, talk about the sense of loss that came from the flooding. So I'm going to stand over here so I can read these quotes. This lady was telling me, to make a long story short, it was horrible. People suffered. Even wild animals were hard to find, like moose and all that. Any kind of animals that were near enough to get caught unaware drowned. So moose was really scarce. A person had to go a long way to try and get a moose because animals were terrified too. They all fled. So can you imagine starvation when there was no job? We were displaced. We weren't even in our usual area. My dad's trapline and hunting area were further up in Janika. That's an arm of the river. Finley area. So we were way down. And when my dad lost his boats, we can't go anywhere. So she's talking about a sort of all the loss that came with the animals, but also a loss of way of life. And then this other person talks more about it. When they started flooding, they burnt all our homes. And when that happened, we couldn't move back up because when they started flooding, the debris with all the trees on the lake and all the reservoir was coming up, and it's too dangerous to go in a boat, to go anywhere on the lake because of all the debris and the high winds and everything else. So this is a community that used to travel frequently by boat up and down the river, and all of a sudden they can't do that. They feel rather stuck in one place. And this is another elder telling me what it was like coming back from residential school to see how the place had changed. Oh, there was just erosion. There was no more in Janika. This is the village before the flood. We were living high on a hill, just windswept, and a lot of trees were down. But it was very emotional for me when I came back because what I once knew as a child was no more. What came with that loss is something that then they talk about like this. There was a hopelessness, just like they gave up. Because pretty soon, now they were introduced to welfare. People quit working. There are people that to this day are still hurting. They're still drinking. A lot have died already. And I say, because of the flooding? And she says, not only that, because of what was taken from them. They just don't have a will anymore. It's a sense of dependency, but for my purposes, it's a more specific form than just welfare. It's a particular relationship that this community is now stuck in with BC Hydro. And so this is a couple that I'm talking to, and one of them has mentioned that it would be cool to have their own windmills somewhere up there. It's a particularly windy place, and there's a lot of erosion because of the dam. So this is something that they think about. And so I ask, you said it'd be cool to have your own community energy power. Why? Like, why do you think that is cool? And don't I sound eloquent? And he says, well, then BC Hydro wouldn't have a lot to say. But then we also use BC Hydro's money to operate a lot of income in the village. It's a touchy subject. Why is it so touchy, I ask? And he says, because of the fact that BC Hydro is helping with putting us to work in little projects here and there. That's the only income out this way, because we don't sustain ourselves out here. So it's actually run by BC Hydro. BC Hydro is putting the money on our table. We don't sustain our own income out here, so it makes it we play by their rules. This is something that kept coming up in my interviews, where every time anyone thought of something they could do about their energy situation, then they'd be like, no, but BC Hydro wouldn't let us do that. And I'm not saying that this is something BC Hydro would or wouldn't actually do, but that there's a sense of powerlessness when it comes to making their own energy decisions. And it's a complicated relationship with BC Hydro that will continue to be complicated for all we know. This other person says, but this thing with hydro, it's going to keep going after we're gone. You watch, they're going to pay. They're still paying. There's no such thing as settlement. It's going to be on their conscience and they know it. So what I'm hoping to get at with this dimension of how they relate to energy decisions in this community is this idea of powerlessness. And so yes, energy poverty in Seikes felt at the community scale by virtue of the fact that they run on diesel and it's expensive for the band to run it. but also that they feel like they're not autonomous in their own decision making, and that they can't change things. Of course, it's also felt at the household level. They have to pay for propane. It's not exactly easy. They compromise convenience and comfort often because of that, and they often have to go without propane. And then they go take showers at their neighbors, and there's all of that. But for me, it's interesting to talk about this other dimension, the community scale, and this emotional dimension of powerlessness, because I think it matters for the kinds of solutions that we offer. Typically, what happens when you identify the problem at the household scale, then you direct your solutions there. And so this is how energy poverty has been typically dealt with. People go in and offer retrofits, and they upgrade the efficiency of the installation of the house, the efficiency of some of the appliances, and hopefully the energy bill will go down and it will be less of a burden for the household. And that might work. Ask me in about a year. That's what we're doing in Musqueam. But I wonder if we identify the problem at a different scale, so the community scale here, and a different dimension, that emotional dimension of powerlessness, would change the types of solutions that we offer. And the quick answer to that is yeah, probably. In this case, for example, I think if we were to address energy poverty up there, it wouldn't be by upgrading the insulation of the houses. It would be through encouraging the development of a community energy system. And Seike is a community that's been actively pursuing this and running into a lot of challenges in that pursuit. BC Hydro might be a part of that, but by encouraging that, perhaps, we can address the powerlessness dimension. So I will stop talking, well under 20 minutes, and just say thank you and take questions. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's an interesting question. In fact, it's even more interesting to think about whether or not I want to call this energy poverty at all. When you ask people up there if they feel energy poor, if you were to put it in those terms, they react by saying, no, this is a community that has loads of energy. And in fact, if you thought about energy access in terms of resilience and the types of energies that you have access to, they'd fare way better than I would. I mean, they can heat their living rooms using wood or their propane heater, or they have electric plug-in heaters. Like, they often have two sources of cooking fuel, so either electric stoves, they would also have, or propane stoves. So it's a diversified energy access situation, and the propane costs are burdensome for a lot of people. But this sense of powerlessness, the fact that they can't do anything about it, that they can't change it, is on their mind a lot. So whether or not I call it energy poverty, I mean, energy poverty has political power for me, and for them. It gets them a kind of attention that they wouldn't otherwise get. So the political administration is behind using that word, but the individual household might not feel particularly deprived as far as energy goes in their household. But nearly everybody brought up the relationship with BC Hydro and how they feel like it's an entirely unjust situation that they have to deal with. So in this case, it's obviously both, and I'd say the powerlessness is something that's on people's minds a lot more. Yeah, Matt. So they don't actually have to pay for electricity right now. The band pays for electricity entirely. One of the things they worry about, though, is going forward, they're in the process of having BC Hydro take over their diesel generator operations as part of the remote community electrification program. And one of the things that they worry about is that they might have to pay, and they don't think it's fair that they should have to pay. So it's not so much about the cost to the household right now. There's a cost to the community because the band pays for electricity, and it's partly subsidized in various ways, but the rest of it, they foot that bill themselves. It's more that a lot of them remember the flood, and a lot of them have heard the stories, and this community has moved a couple of times since, and like the couple that I interviewed, like he was talking about, they continue to be beholden to BC Hydro in a lot of ways. BC Hydro employs them for wind erosion control, and so a lot of income comes from BC Hydro, and it's always there and present for them. The dam is right there, so it's something that's very much on their minds. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay, so this particular story, it's specific, but many First Nations communities in BC have had those kinds of relationships, those kinds of experiences with the government. So not always BC Hydro, but some form of it. And there are there's like, I want to say 36 remote First Nations communities in BC, and many of them are facing similar challenges to SAYK in terms of pursuing their own community energy projects. So it's generalizable to those communities in that sense. And I mean, across Canada, there's some 200 remote communities where they often operate diesel and are pursuing renewable projects for various reasons. Beyond that, I find it interesting to think about the community dimension because it allows me to think about other things that we might do to address energy poverty. So rather than directing the solutions again at the household level, what kinds of things we can do beyond that to address the things that create access problems. So I find it useful as a thinking tool, and that's why I chase that dimension. Terry. Mm-hmm. So if only I had the answer to that question. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hadi's laughing. It's what he's been trying to do, I guess, for the past 5 years. He's been trying to rewrite those rules and figure out a way of making Seike's energy project work, given the relationship with BC Hydro. And what we've learned is that it's going nowhere. So that's definitely part of the problem, right? But also, there is, oh, Heidi's not going to like me saying this. So, demand in remote communities, or how much power you can sell in remote communities, is limited to the community's demand. You can only make as much power as they'll consume because they're not on a grid. So the size of a project that you might build up there is always going to be small. It gets complicated when you have BC Hydro in there wanting all kinds of redundancy, or if the community insists on having a 100% renewable goal. And it gets technically difficult because many of the technologies just that you'd use up there aren't small enough. So part of it is like going after smaller projects that might give a sense of autonomy, sort of a more modular type of project where it's small, you can build on it later, but it demonstrates that you can do something. It might not solve the energy problem up there, but it might address that sense of powerlessness. So I'd say go for smaller. There is a not after. Yes, Kai.
So I guess I sense that you were initially heading after an explanation and
Mm-hmm.
found the story So I'm wondering where you're heading towards.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I still see this as a story of energy poverty, just a particular dimension of it. And the dimensions that you typically chase after, so that higher proportions of income spent on energy bills or household practices that are compromised in terms of convenience and comfort, those dimensions of it are still there. I just didn't tell that story today. What I'm saying with Seike is that there is this additional dimension. So that's going to be there, but I'm still going to look at energy poverty across Canada. That's still a focus for me. And I think there's additional learnings from these particular case studies. And so, yeah, no, I'm still thinking of calling it energy poverty. Am I allowed? No? Okay.
I think we'll dismiss the time. Sorry, it's 1:30.
All right. Well, ask me later.